Okay, so let's dive into a question that, well, it pops up a lot, doesn't it? When you start comparing ancient philosophy with, modern thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea, is there like a fundamental clash between ancient Stoicism, which everyone associates with mastering emotions, and modern psychology, which often sounds like it's telling us to, well, listen to and accept our feelings?
Exactly. It feels like a real contradiction. Like, are you supposed to be this immovable stoic rock, or are you meant to be, fully feeling everything?
It's a common perception, for sure. Stoics aiming for this calm state by controlling passions, then psychology exploring how emotions work, how they can even be useful.
Yeah.
Seems like they're pulling in opposite directions.
Right. So for this deep dive, we've gathered a whole range of stuff. We've got a Reddit thread where people are really wrestling with this, plus articles on emotional psychology, some deep Stoic philosophy texts, and pieces looking directly at how these two fields might relate.
Yeah, a good mix. And our mission today is basically to sift through all that. We want to pull out the really key insights, understand how these seemingly different views look at our emotions.
Do they really clash, or is there more nuance, maybe even some overlap?
That's the goal, to
Hmm.
cut through this simple control versus welcome idea and give you a really solid understanding of this whole fascinating area.
Perfect. So maybe let's start with the modern side. When psychologists talk about emotion, what do they actually mean? Because the sources stress it's not just a vague feeling.
Right, it's more specific.
Yeah.
Psychology makes some important distinctions, between emotions, feelings, and moods. And emotion is usually seen as this complex reaction pattern.
Reaction pattern.
Yeah, involving what you experience inside, how you act on the outside, and what your body does physiologically. And it's tied to something personally significant happening.
So it's a response to something that matters to you.
That's the core idea. Feelings, then, are described more as the conscious part of that, your subjective awareness of the emotion, often shaped by your thoughts and past experiences.
Okay, so the emotion is the whole shebang body behavior experience, and the feeling is the I feel angry or I feel happy part you're aware of.
You got it.
Yeah.
And then moods are sort of lower intensity, longer lasting states, often without a really obvious single trigger, like just being in a funk or feeling generally cheerful.
Gotcha. That clarifies the terms. So, focusing on the emotion itself, the sources mention three main components psychologists look at.
They do. First, there's the subjective experience. That's the trigger, the stimulus.
Yeah.
Seeing something, hearing news, a memory. It's super personal. The same event can spark totally different emotions in different people.
Totally. My reaction to a deadline versus maybe yours could be quite different.
Exactly. Then there's the physiological response.
Yeah.
That's your body kicking in.
Heart racing, palms sweaty, that sort of thing.
Yep. Psychology often links this back to evolution's survival mechanisms. Think fight or flight. It's often automatic.
And the third piece is the behavioral response, how we show it.
That's right. Smiling, frowning, maybe sighing, yelling. The outward expression. And while some expressions seem universal, like a basic smile or frown, how we express emotion is definitely shaped by culture and learning.
Yeah, I remember one source making a point about how bottling up those expressions, like not showing you're stressed, can actually have physical effects, like raising your heart rate.
It did mention that, which suggests that, expressing emotions in healthy ways isn't just about communication. It might be physically important, too.
Interesting. And psychology also tries to categorize emotions, basic versus complex.
Yeah, that's a common way to think about it. Basic emotions are seen as, fundamental, maybe universal, with distinct facial expressions.
Hmm.
Things like happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust. The usual suspects.
Though the exact list might vary a bit.
Right. Maybe 6, maybe 4, depending on the theory. But they're seen as the building blocks. Complex emotions are then combinations or variations of these.
Like jealousy or grief.
Exactly. Things that involve more cognitive appraisal, maybe less obvious universal expressions. The sources mentioned hate potentially being a mix of fear, anger, and disgust. Tools like Plutchik's wheel try to map these relationships.
And the sources briefly touched on different theories. James Lange, Cannon-Bard. We don't need to get bogged down in the details.
No, but the point was just to show there are different models for how an emotion unfolds. Does the body react first, then we feel? Or do they happen together? But the common thread is always a significant stimulus triggers a reaction involving experience, body, and behavior.
Right, that basic sequence holds.
Mhm.
Okay, so given all this, the components, the types, the evolutionary roots, why does modern psychology seem to place so much value on understanding and even expressing emotions?
Well, the source is really connected back to being human. Emotions are signals, right? They tell us what's important, how we're doing, what needs attention. They guide our behavior, help us communicate it.
They're functional, not just feelings.
Very much so from this perspective. And understanding them is the foundation of what we call emotional intelligence. Being aware of your emotions, managing them, understanding others' emotions.
Which the sources link to better outcomes in life.
Yeah, things like better leadership, stronger relationships, better performance at work. It's about using that emotional information effectively, not being ruled by it or ignoring it completely.
Okay, that gives us a good handle on the modern psychological view. Now let's do that pivot. Ancient Stoicism. How did they approach this whole emotional landscape?
So the Stoics had this central concept, passions, or pathe in Greek. And this is crucial. They weren't talking about every single feeling we have. They meant specific kinds of emotional suffering or disturbance.
So not a blanket rejection of all emotion. That seems like a really important distinction.
It's huge, and it's where a lot of confusion comes in. The Stoic idea, based on the sources, is that these pathe, these passions, come from a mistake in reasoning, specifically making incorrect evaluative judgments.
Judgments about what?
About things that are ultimately outside our direct control. Things the Stoics called indifference, like health, wealth, reputation, what other people do or say.
Well, it's the famous dichotomy of control. So the problem isn't the thing itself, but judging it incorrectly. Judging something indifferent as truly good or truly bad.
Exactly. A passion, for a Stoic, is basically a faulty judgment in action. It's rooted in a false notion about what's really good or evil. When we think external things are the source of our happiness or misery, that's where the passions arise.
And they identified specific types of these problematic passions.
Yeah, the four main ones are distress, fear, phobos, lust or excessive desire, epithumia, and delight or irrational elation.
Okay, can you give quick examples?
Sure. Distress is about feeling pain over a present supposed evil, like being upset about that traffic jam. Fear is anxiety about a future supposed evil, like worrying about losing your job. Lust is craving a future supposed good, like desperately wanting fame. And delight is getting overly excited about a present supposed good, like being ecstatic over winning a small lottery prize.
And the Stoics saw these as irrational.
Yes, because they're based on those false judgments about what truly matters, which for them was virtue and acting reasonably. These passions disturb your inner peace because they tie your well-being to things you can't fully control.
And the goal then is that state called apatheia.
Right, apatheia. And here's where we have to be super careful because the sources hammer this point home.
Yeah.
It is not about being emotionless. That's the #1 misunderstanding.
Okay, so what is it?
It's freedom from these disturbing, irrational passions. Freedom from the emotional turmoil caused by faulty judgments. It's about achieving inner tranquility by not being yanked around by reactions to external events we misjudge.
So freedom from suffering caused by bad thinking, not freedom from feeling anything at all.
Precisely. The ideal Stoic sage, the Sophos, isn't an unfeeling autoponon. They experience what the Stoics called good feelings, or eupatheia.
Eupatheia. Okay, so these are the Stoic-approved emotions.
You could say that.
Yeah.
They're described as clear-headed, rational emotional responses. They're appropriate, not excessive. They align with reason and are directed towards what is genuinely good or bad according to Stoic ethics.
Which is mainly virtue and vice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The sources mention 3 main ones. Joy, chara, which is rational elation based on present virtue. Wish, boulesis, a rational desire for future virtue or good. And caution, eulabeia, which is a rational aversion to future vice or genuine harm to one's character.
So the Stoic path isn't about emotional suppression, but about cultivating these rational, appropriate emotional responses by focusing your judgment correctly on what you can control, on virtue leading to peace of mind.
That's the core idea. Living a flourishing life guided by reason, not tossed about by irrational reactions to externals.
Okay. So Stoicism. Manage passions via judgment, aim for tranquility, psychology. Understand and work with emotions, they can be adaptive. This brings us right back to that apparent conflict, the one highlighted in that Reddit thread. How do the sources start to bridge this gap?
Yeah, that Reddit discussion really put its finger on it. Stoicism says control, psychology says welcome. But as you dig deeper into the sources, it gets more complicated.
The contradiction isn't as stark as it first appears.
Not quite. Even within that Reddit thread, people were pointing out, hey, Stoicism isn't about just stuffing feelings down. It's about understanding the source of the feeling, the judgment, and then managing your reaction by examining that judgment. That's very different from just denying the feeling exists.
And that process, examining the underlying thought or judgment. That sounds familiar.
Sounds very familiar if you know anything about modern cognitive therapies. This is where the sources draw a really strong, explicit line connecting Stoicism to therapies like CBT and REBT.
Cognitive behavioral therapy and rational emotive behavior therapy.
Exactly. Albert Ellis, who created REBT, was very open about being influenced by Stoics like Epictetus. The core principles are remarkably similar.
What's that shared core principle?
It really boils down to that famous Epictetus quote you find everywhere. It's not events themselves that disturb us, but our interpretations of them. This is absolutely fundamental to both. Our thoughts about a situation create our feelings, and our feelings then drive our behavior.
The thoughts, feelings, behaviors triangle.
Precisely. The sources use that simple swimming example, right? Thinking about swimming. If you love it, the thought leads to happy feelings, maybe planning a swim. If you fear water, the same thought triggers anxiety, leading you to avoid pools.
Same initial thought, different interpretation, different feeling, different action.
Exactly. And what do cognitive therapies do? They directly work on challenging and changing those interpretations. The unrealistic, unhelpful, exaggerated thoughts, those incorrect judgments, as the Stoics would say.
So you change the thought to change the feeling and the behavior.
That's the mechanism. You address the cognitive process to manage the emotional outcome.
So pulling it together, the sources suggest the apparent clash isn't really control versus welcome. It's more about how and when you engage with the emotion. Stoicism isn't about suppressing the feeling itself, but about reshaping the judgment that generates the problematic passion before it takes hold. Cognitive therapies use structured techniques to achieve a very similar goal, managing the emotional response by tackling the underlying thought patterns.
Right. Both recognize that crucial link between thinking and feeling, and both offer ways to work with that link, using reason to navigate our emotional lives. It's less about suppression, more about intelligent regulation via cognition.
That makes a lot of sense for understanding the general overlap, but let's drill down into a specific, tricky emotion, where the sources showed a much sharper contrast with the traditional Stoic view: anger.
Oh yeah, anger is a big one.
Yeah.
Because the classical Stoic stance, particularly from someone like Seneca, was incredibly strong. He literally called it a temporary madness and argued it shouldn't just be controlled, it should be eradicated.
Eradicated, not just managed. Wow, why such an extreme position?
Well, in their framework, anger is seen as fundamentally irrational. It arises because you've judged an external indifferent, like being insulted or wronged, as a genuine evil, which is a mistaken judgment. It's seen as harmful because it clouds reason, prevents virtuous action, and often includes a desire for revenge, which they rejected. So it's a prime example of a destructive pathos.
Okay, that's the pure Stoic logic. But the sources we looked at push back pretty hard against this total rejection, don't they?
They really do. Several counterarguments come up. One is that anger is actually natural and potentially adaptive.
Adaptive? How? It feels so destructive sometimes.
Well, sources mention evolutionary perspectives and neuroscience suggesting anger isn't just a glitch, it's part of our evolved toolkit. It might be necessary for things like asserting boundaries, protecting ourselves, or persisting towards difficult goals. It provides energy, motivation. It's not something we simply choose, like picking a faulty judgment. It might be more innate.
That's a total shift from seeing it as just a reasoning error. What about the idea that anger always makes us irrational?
That gets challenged too. Some sources cited studies suggesting that anger, in certain contexts, can actually sharpen thinking. It can help focus attention, boost analytical reasoning by filtering out irrelevant details, helping us solve problems or negotiate more effectively.
So you can be angry and rational at the same time.
The research suggests it's possible. One source even said anger has its own particular logic. When channeled constructively, it can apparently help us get better outcomes, build coalitions, push for change. It's not inherently destructive.
Okay, and then there's the moral dimension. Stoics saw it as immoral.
But many other perspectives, ancient and modern, disagree strongly. The sources bring up the idea that anger can be a vital moral response. It can be an expression of recognizing injustice, holding people accountable, demanding respect or repair when harm is done. Adam Smith was mentioned, suggesting anger aims to make the wrongdoer aware of the injury.
And this leads to that really powerful point that sometimes not getting angry in the face of injustice could be the real moral failing, like being passive or complicit.
Exactly, that idea of acquiescing in evil. The sources use those incredibly potent examples. Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., described as properly angry men. Their anger at profound injustice wasn't suppressed. It was channeled. It fueled their fight for change. That anecdote about the scholar wrestling with the Ukrainian father's righteous rage really hits home. Sometimes anger seems like the only sane moral response to true evil, not just a reaction to an indifferent.
It shows anger can have direction, purpose, and moral weight. It's not just blind rage.
Right, and there was even a connection made to creativity.
Anger sparking creativity.
Yeah, examples like Nina Simone's protest songs fueled by civil rights anger, Beethoven's powerful stormy music, Picasso's Guernica being called rage and oil, a direct response to wartime atrocity. Anger can be a profound motivator for expression, for art, for making a statement.
Wow, okay. So, summing up the anger point. While the Stoics had very valid reasons to warn against letting anger consume us, the modern sources present a compelling case. Anger can be natural, adaptive, sometimes even rational, morally necessary, and creatively fertile. The pure Stoic rejection might be missing a lot of that complexity.
It definitely suggests the picture is more nuanced than just labeling anger as a madness to be destroyed. Its potential role seems much broader.
So let's pull back again now. We've seen the psychological view, the Stoic view, the overlaps in cognitive approaches, and the specific challenges like anger. How do we synthesize all this? Are cognition and emotion really separate battling forces?
I think that analogy from the PMC source really nails it. Thinking of emotion and cognition not as opponents, but as strands of a single rope made strong by their being thoroughly intertwined.
That image feels much closer to what we've been discussing. How does psychology show this intertwining in action?
Well, it clearly shows cognition shaping emotion. Appraisal theories are all about this, how you interpret something dictates how you feel about it. And neuroimaging studies show that consciously reappraising a situation doesn't just change how you say you feel, it actually changes brain activity patterns associated with the emotion.
So thinking literally changes the emotional response as it's happening.
It seems so.
Yeah.
It's not just putting a lid on it afterwards, it's influencing its development. And the reverse is true too. Emotion regulates cognition.
How so?
Emotions grab our attention, tell us what's important, motivate us to think or act. Feeling anxious might trigger problem-solving focus. Feeling happy might broaden our thinking. Emotions provide constant feedback, guiding our cognitive resources.
And the Stoic practices fit right into this intertwined model.
Perfectly. Their focus on examining impressions and testing judgments is a form of cognitive regulation of emotion. They intuitively grasped that working on your thoughts was the key. And their ideal of eupathia, those rational, appropriate good feelings, looks a lot like the modern goal of emotional intelligence, of having emotions that are adaptive and aligned with reality.
The sources also had that really interesting point about how cognition constrains the meaning of emotion, affecting its power.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Think about therapy again. It often works by taking vague, overcoming feelings like free-floating anxiety and constraining them, giving them structure by linking them to specific thoughts or situations. Suddenly it feels more manageable.
Like the example of Zen and pain. Focusing just on the sensation itself, constraining its meaning, stripping away the fear and catastrophizing around it.
Exactly. You don't eliminate the physical sensation, but you change the emotional suffering attached to it by changing the cognitive frame. And interestingly, the sources noted that sometimes unconstraining effect, letting go of that cognitive labeling, is central to experiences like deep meditation or mystical states.
So really, this deep dive reveals less of a fundamental conflict and more of an evolution in understanding.
I think so. Ancient Stoicism offered these incredibly powerful practical insights into how our judgments drive our emotional reactions, laying groundwork that modern cognitive science is now exploring with sophisticated tools. Psychology confirms the huge role of thought, but also reveals the complexity, the functionality, and even the potential benefits of emotions the Stoics might have dismissed too readily as mere passions. It affirms the value of rational engagement, but with a richer understanding of what we're engaging with.
It's all about that intricate dance between how we think and how we feel.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So after digging through all these sources, exploring both ancient wisdom and modern science, what's the main takeaway message?
I think the big takeaway is this. Stoicism rightly emphasized how our judgments fuel emotional turmoil and offered ways to gain tranquility through reason. Modern psychology explores the deeper complexity and adaptive roles of emotions. But where they meet, powerfully, is in recognizing the profound link between our thoughts, our interpretations, and how we ultimately feel and act. The goal isn't necessarily to eliminate emotion, but to understand its roots in our thinking and use our reason, our cognitive abilities to navigate and channel it constructively.
It seems both, in their own ways, point towards the incredible power we have within our own minds to shape our experience of the world.
Absolutely. The power of interpretation is immense.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to reflect on. If our feelings are so deeply tied to our interpretations, and if even difficult emotions like anger might hold potential for positive action when understood and directed, how can you become more aware of the specific judgments shaping your emotional life day to day? And perhaps, what does it truly mean to be rational when our reason and our feelings are, as these sources suggest, so deeply fundamentally intertwined?